Something truly frightening arrives here on NES Works episode 146, just in time for the holiday.
What was all this about?
Sunsoft landed itself a huge hit here in the US in 1989 with Blaster Master. Naturally, going into the next year, they wanted to keep the momentum going and created a follow-up. Unfortunately, they went about creating that follow-up in the weirdest way possible. Fester's Quest has got to be the single most bizarre choice we've yet seen for an NES license. Everything else to this point you can understand the existence of to some degree. You have LJN and High-Tech Expressions and Acclaim peddling current media properties and sports corporations. And even the imported Edge stuff like Golgo 13 and Fist of the North Star at least had direct connections to contemporary media localization efforts. But Fester's Quest here on NES in the autumn of 1989? It's kooky and mysterious, though not especially creepy or spooky. I think the time compression effect of retrospection tends to obscure what a strange venture this was in hindsight. After all, Fester's Quest comes from the same era that gave us Raul Julia's big screen turn as Gomez Addams, supported by luminaries like Angelica Houston and Christopher Lloyd, even as it put Christina Ricci on the Hollywood board. The Addams Family movie was a pretty big deal, and it resulted in a lot of video games across every platform imaginable. However, Fester's Quest had nothing to do with the movie. In fact, according to its producer, Sunsoft put it together unaware of the film. They assumed the Hollywood musings made during license negotiations by Lady Colleton, the widow of Addams Family creator Charles Addams, were simply fanciful thoughts by an elderly lady. That's what makes Fester's Quest so weird. Well, part of what makes it so weird. At the time that Sunsoft created and published this game, the Addams Family was a nothing of a property. It had become a staple of late-night or weekend broadcasts on local UHF channels, the kind of thing that you might spot while flipping through the channels on a boring Saturday afternoon and watch for a few minutes if your choices came down to that or, say, professional bowling. Fester's Quest is based on a television series that began in 1964, 25 years before this game shipped, and was in turn based on cartoon characters who had debuted in 1938. It's hard to come up with an equivalency for something like that in 2024. I don't know, maybe if they did something with Star Trek, specifically Star Trek Voyager on a platform intended for kids. Oh no, wait, sorry, bad example. Besides, the 80s were a different time for media. Corporations hadn't fully consolidated their control over popular entertainment, and didn't have that crippling fear of creating something new that defines them now. Really, society had just begun to enter the world of endless property recycling that defines today's mediascape. Thanks for nothing, Batman. All of this is to say that it's hard to imagine the Addams Family speaking to the tween and teen audience that comprised the NES Core's fanbase. Certainly none of my friends were clamoring to pick up a copy, even the friends whose parents let them buy as many games as they wanted, which is to say I never played this game back in the day because none of my rich classmates had a copy I could borrow. The Addams Family property would have resonated more with those kids' parents, but it's hard to imagine a game this twitchy and difficult finding much of an audience in an era where adults playing video games was simply not done. This is an infamously hard and frustrating game that really requires a level of resilience and willingness to endure unfair tedium that only children transfixed by a mediocre video game possess. But hell, what do I know? A year later, Atari would publish Midnight Mutants, a game based around Grandpa from the Munsters, that mediocre store brand knockoff of the Addams Family. So I guess this was simply the moment for games about weird old pale guys and gothic sitcoms from the black and white broadcast era. And somehow, the folks at Sunsoft decided that this game about a character from a half-remembered syndicated show should, in fact, be a vehicle for some of the most devastatingly difficult gameplay on the system. If Fester's Quest is known for anything these days, besides the fact that its box art consists of a garish painting of Jackie Coogan's bald, pale face, it's the fact that it's an unbelievably difficult game. This comes down to yet another bizarre thing about Fester's Quest. Sunsoft used this as their excuse to make a Blaster Master sequel in all but name. But this is not a sequel that focuses on the good parts of Blaster Master with the jumping tank and the cool platforming combat and the exploration. No, it's a sequel that consists entirely of the bad parts, the top-down on-foot exploration bits with infinitely respawning enemies and the progressive gun upgrade system. Imagine the top-down interior sections of Blaster Master, but used not as destinations, but rather as passages between spaces in the outside world. And also, the outside world plays in the same top-down format as the dungeons. Also, sometimes there are Portopia-style first-person exploration sequences, because why the hell not? All of this to present kids with an adventure in which Uncle Fester uses a gun and a whip to battle aliens. Because why the hell not? A brutally difficult shooter in which Uncle Fester rescues his brother Gomez from aliens doesn't exactly fit the Addams Family license, but it also doesn't not fit it. The whole thing about the Addams Family is that the characters were weird and unpredictable. And frankly, if any vintage TV sitcom character were going to pick up a laser blunderbuss and start blowing faceless frog aliens into digital dust, it would be Fester Addams. It sure wouldn't be Darren or Other Darren or the Skipper. Maybe Lucy, though. These mismatched elements come together to create a game that is almost really good. It's strange and clumsy, and has a very distinct experiential curve. At first you think, yikes, this is weird and bad. But after a while you get into the groove of the action and realize, wow, this is actually pretty good, kind of cool. Then you play a little longer and realize, no, it really is a mess and you hate it. Fester's Quest is another case of Japanese developers tasked with creating a game about an American media property they don't really know or fully understand. Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but with an old bald man instead of combat reptiles. Although you can't really blame cultural hiccups for the premise of this game, because all of that came from the US side. A decade ago, Kid Fenris cracked the mystery of Fester's Quest's creation by doing some actual journalism and interviewing the game's designers, former Sunsoft USA employees Richard Robbins and Michael Mendheim. Despite all appearances, Fester's Quest did not result from an American marketing guy deciding to import a game from Japan and localize it by sticking a completely unrelated character or property on it. That would come later with the Onoid. No, Fester's Quest exists because Robbins had a dream about creating a game starring Uncle Fester in the style of Pee-wee's Playhouse. So he set out to land the Addams Family license and build a game around it. This resulted in what may well have been the first creation of its kind, an NES game designed by Americans and programmed by a team in Japan. This would become more common in later years, but remember, we're just now at the point where trans-Pacific crossovers between creative teams had begun to take form, a la Skyshark. Bear in mind that this was long before the days of internet video conferencing, and all of this collaboration took place via pricey international calls, faxes, and express shipments. So that probably explains why Fester's Quest turned out so messily. It was an early experiment in international game design collaboration, but it still happened on an NES development budget and timeline. It turns out the game didn't receive much in the way of playtesting, and it was rushed into production before feedback like, for the love of God, please incorporate some manner of save or password system, could be incorporated. And no, you couldn't fix it in the day one patch back then. Now, I could ream this game, an unforgiving Blaster Master sequel wearing an Addams Family skin despite not having much of anything at all to do with the Addams Family. I could ream it for its failings, complain about the roadblocks it throws out to prevent players from actually having a good time with it. But that's old hat at this point. Instead of leaning on that old shtick, I'd like to take a more positive tack. Let's look at the good parts of Fester's Quest and explore how the entire experience could have been good and fun with just a few moderate game design tweaks. Because it's not good or fun, at least not if you actually want to finish the game fairly. It's tedious and unreasonable, even by the dicey standards of NES games based on licensed properties. But I do appreciate the fact that the entire affair is just weird as hell. It should be. The Addams Family was weird. That was their thing. And I appreciate the fact that all of this weirdness exists in service of a game that isn't quite a true Metroidvania or action RPG, but nevertheless has the feel of those games. Fester's Quest takes place in a single open-world space, a chunk of city real estate that's been divided up inconveniently, with its areas connected by underground tunnels. You need to roam the city in a sort of clockwise progression, ultimately making your way to the UFO at the center where Gomez has been abducted. This involves Fester Addams destroying a seemingly infinite host of creeps and creatures, led by a host of horrible bosses, with occasional passive assists by the family at large. Wednesday gives you vice grips, and Pugsley dispenses TNT like any good tween would do. Lurch can jump in and clear the screen of rabble, and Cousin It hands out health and invincibility potions. Happily, although Fester's Quest makes use of Blaster Master's reviled weapon power-up scheme that allows you to upgrade your firepower by collecting icons, it does not incorporate the power-down mechanic in which taking damage reduces your firepower a step. Instead, even when taking damage, you maintain your current attack level until you collect a red powered down icon, which you'll quickly learn to identify and avoid. Once you acquire your secondary weapon, a whip, you can also upgrade that through several steps the same way. It makes the game feel considerably less spiteful than Blaster Master, at least in that regard anyway. The entire game world has a consistent and unified feel, with inaccessible spaces visible but out of reach to entice you to seek out your next connecting passage. And despite the general sense that Fester's Quest really has no business being an Addams Family game, it does make use of the show's conventions in a handful of sensible ways, the most notable of these being the light bulb element. In the TV series, Uncle Fester could cause light bulbs to glow by placing them in his mouth. So, naturally, you need to acquire light bulbs in order to illuminate the underground paths. You find light bulbs in an inventory grid of collectibles and consumables on the game's subscreen. Again, it doesn't quite reach action RPG status, since there are no real character upgrades for Fester to collect, besides temporary weapon boosts and a pair of health max boosts, but it does demand some degree of inventory management and item farming. The problem with Fester's Quest is that literally every single one of its good points comes with a caveat. For example, you really only need the whip because Fester lacks a gun option that allows him to fire straight ahead in a narrow focus. His base level gun fires a single projectile straight ahead, but that has terrible range and almost zero attack power. The gun's upgrades resemble the one in Blaster Master, adding extra projectiles to the attack and changing your beam's movement patterns. Unlike in Blaster Master though, the game treats these projectiles as a single object. If a single element of your blunderbuss beam hits an obstacle, the entire attack comes to a dead stop. The remaining components don't fly on ahead the way Jason's did. Since you spend an awful lot of the game fighting through the narrow, constrictive passages of sewers, you'll often find that your gun simply can't hit anything. No matter where you stand, the walls block its path, so you need the whip. And even if you keep those weapons powered up, the game remains a miserable slog due to the bullet sponge nature of the bad guys. You'll experience a pleasant sense of empowerment at the beginning of the game as you collect weapon icons and gain the ability to completely shred aliens that took a while to destroy before, but once you meet the first boss and move to the world beyond, the downside of the icon-based power down mechanic becomes clear. That is, the game assumes that you'll be at max power at all times, so most enemies take an unbelievable amount of damage to destroy. Worse, they like to crowd you and approach from oblique angles that your oddball weapon paths may not be able to manage. And they regenerate infinitely when you scroll their spawn points to the edges of the screen. You have a few alternate attack options like TNT and Lurch, but even these don't kill a lot of enemies in a single hit. Bosses have the same tiresome sense of durability as the ones in Blaster Master, and because Fester can only take a couple of hits before either dying or dipping into his precious potion reserve, you have to fight them for what feels like an eternity without making any mistakes. Because if you die, Fester gets sent back to the beginning of the game. Now, you keep your progress through the world, and all the items and weapons you've acquired, including gun boosts, but you return to the opening screen. Die against a late-game boss? Allow a random low-level mob to scoot in because your stupid blunderbuss beam can't hit it at that particular shallow angle? Well, brother, either way, you get to fight all the way back to where you were, retracing your steps through the game every single time. You will learn to truly hate the opening areas of Fester's Quest. Its critical paths through the world will become seared into your neurons through sheer repetition. The game desperately needs shortcuts that open as you make progress. Bridges that cross gaps or hidden passages through obstructive topiary, whatever. You could argue that this design concept didn't become truly codified in video games until FromSoft stuck an elevator from the Parish in Dark Souls 2, or maybe even earlier, when Samus Aran shattered the ever-loving hell out of that tube through Meridian in Super Metroid, but that was 5 years after Fester's Quest. Yet that's simply not true. Blaster Master included some shortcuts through the game to ease backtracking and travel, which only became available once you gained new tank powers. Blaster Master, the game by the same people who built Fester's Quest. They already solved this problem. But no, you still have to slog your way through the entire game every time you die, no matter how far you've made it. You thought Zelda 2 was pretty rough with its lives and restart mechanic, but that game also had overworld shortcuts that opened as you made progress, and at least Link scaled in power relative to his enemies and didn't have to deal with infinitely respawning bullet sponges every step of the way. This game desperately needs checkpoints and shortcuts, but at the same time you also need to deal with the reality of being sent back to the beginning of the adventure, because that's the only way you can top off your supply of TNT and vice grips besides beating a boss. Those items only appear in the opening area of the game, and if you run out of vice grips, you'll be permanently reduced to moving at half speed by certain enemy projectiles. All of this is to say that Fester's Quest is unfriendly and unfair in the way you'd expect from a lower tier NES game. Not from one that looks and sounds this good, and appears to have some pretty rock-solid programming propping it up. It's all the more vexing because it fixes some of Blaster Master's shortcomings while making entirely new design mistakes. And underneath it all, there's a damn good game, begging to be broken free from the aggressively miserable design that encrusts the enjoyable parts. With another passive design tweaking, I really think Fester's Quest could have been an all-timer. Nothing would prevent it from being a weird choice for a licensed release, but if that had been simply a creepy kooky facet of a masterpiece, we just love Fester's Quest all the more for its improbability. But the hurried nature of NES game development cycles, combined with the fact that Sunsoft's staff were attempting a cutting-edge international collaboration in a communications environment poorly suited for such efforts, means that Fester's Quest simply existed at the wrong time in the wrong world in the wrong era, at least to fully realize its potential. The European release of the game did at least make some tweaks to the design in an attempt to sand it down and make the rough edges less painful, and ROM hackers have had a few different goes at revamping Fester's Quest as well. But there's no truly definitive way to play it and not feel like someone at Sunsoft had their heart set on making you, personally, miserable, short of using an invincibility code or emulator rewind features. Nevertheless, Fester's Quest enjoyed surprisingly extensive coverage in Nintendo Power. I guess they felt that the combination of Blaster Master and that TV show that sometimes runs in the background while the family is doing more interesting things made for a surefire hit that kids needed to know about, and the magazine went out of its way to make Fester's Quest look pretty cool. It saw a 2-page preview spread in issue 6, followed by a huge 8-page feature in issue 8, accompanied by a fold-out map that depicted the entire game world in detail. The magazine even included maps for the first-person zones. They really wanted you to play and beat Fester's Quest. The irony is that Fester's Quest is based on a character portrayed by Jackie Coogan, one of Hollywood's first child stars, and a child whose parents took his wealth for themselves, thus inspiring the establishment of a law to protect the integrity of kids working in film and their earnings. Now, here's Nintendo Power, doing its best to sell this crushingly difficult game to its audience of little kids. It really makes you wish someone had established a law to protect children from opportunistic promotional magazines, you know? Next time on NES Works, yet another boomer media property gets regurgitated into the unsuspecting laps of the exennial NES fanbase.